Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. President Donald Trump made no mention of North Korea in his State of the Union address. In previous addresses, he sent important messages on North Korea. The day after the speech, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien highlighted Chairman Kim Jong-un's denuclearization promise and urged the North to sit down for talks. Today, we discuss the U.S. strategy on North Korea.
The Iranian regime must abandon its pursuit of nuclear weapons, stop spreading terror, death, and destruction.
There's an utter disregard on his part for U.S. domestic politics when Kim Jong-un has not lived up to the promises he made in Singapore, the commitment he made to denuclearize North Korea.
In the studio with me is Mr. James Schoff, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Schoff was a Senior Advisor for East Asia Policy to the Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. Also joining me is Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S. Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of Seoul's foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. I want to start off with why President Trump didn't mention North Korea in his State of the Union address. It was his first time. What do you think was the intent behind this?
Well, in part, it signals that President Trump is going to be domestically focused this year. But also the North Koreans have indicated that there's not much to gain from focusing on North Korea for President Trump. In contrast to the post-DMZ meeting, where the U.S. seemed desperate for talks, the State of the Union address not mentioning North Korea is a useful corrective to the framework that makes it look like the U.S. is chasing after North Korea.
Mm-hmm. So in 2018, we've heard President Trump criticizing North Korea's human rights abuses. And in the following year, we heard the president confirming that he's going to meet with Chairman Kim in Vietnam. So is there some kind of strategy behind this? Has this played into the U.S.'s interest this time?
The biggest issue to me is why highlight something that isn't going so well? And I think Trump is very focused on the election this year. And the North Korea story for him is something he built up very large and with a lot of fanfare and drama, and it hasn't delivered. And it's a stark contrast to, as you mentioned, the earlier State of the Union speeches where he was really playing up his toughness with North Korea. Then he talks about being in love and this great relationship is going to deliver something. There's not much confidence in the White House right now that they can have success with North Korea, so I think they just downplayed it.
Mm-hmm. So then how do you think the North Koreans took this absence of message from President Trump this year?
Well, they may have been relieved, frankly, not to have been called out, because I believe that the North Korean default position at this time is actually also to wait during an election year until political leadership in the U.S. sorts out. And it looks like they're retrenching and focusing on maybe resumption of talks in the spring of 2021 rather than doing anything this year, unless President Trump simply offers them a deal that's too good to be true.
Do you agree with?
I agree to the extent that I'm sure North Korea did not expect some grand compromise gesture in the State of the Union. That's political suicide in a way right now in the United States. But this unpredictability factor is still hanging out there.
Mm-hmm. So starting in the new year, we haven't really seen President Trump publicly mention North Korea. So do you think this is President Trump's new strategy on North Korea in 2020?
I guess I keep coming back to the idea that I just think they don't have much confidence in this policy going forward. And maybe, I think it's a lack of experience.
Well, that may be the case. I think that it also may be that President Trump feels like he has what he needs. And in that case, it's incumbent upon the North Koreans to make themselves into an issue. But unfortunately, the only way that the North Koreans can make themselves into an issue is to raise tensions and engage in further provocations. And so that's really the interesting dilemma, I think, in an election year.
So we haven't seen the president talk about North Korea a lot, but at the same time, we are seeing the Secretary of State and the president's national security advisor saying that this is a promise that Chairman Kim made during the Singapore summit. So all in all, what do you think is the administration's strategy on North Korea?
Yeah. Whereas if you go back to the Singapore Declaration, the pledge was to work towards complete denuclearization. And we really don't know what, in Kim Jong-un's mind, the conditions were for achieving that objective. And so I'm not sure that it's going to be really very successful to simply assert that Kim Jong-un made a promise. I mean, I don't think that a lot of people put a lot of stock in the credibility of Kim Jong-un's promises anyway.
Do you think that the administration is putting more emphasis on the officials in order to move the negotiations forward rather than the president speaking up front?
So the consensus is to hold the line, be flexible, offer talks, be the ones who are ready to talk unconditionally and kind of put subtle pressure on North Korea to come back to the table without giving a major compromise. But there's still that unpredictability factor of Trump. Maybe he jumps in with some kind of, I want a meeting or I want to do something. But right now, Trump is, I think Scott's right. Maybe he's got what he needs for now, as long as North Korea doesn't test a nuclear weapon, launch an ICBM as a test. And those are the two big things that could change the dynamic right now.
I want to touch upon the indications that we're getting from the White House and Congress. We are hearing that the president might act on North Korea quite soon enough. So should we take note of this, indications coming from the administration and the Congress?
You should always keep an eye on what people are saying, but I actually think that the critical decisions are in North Korea. The ball is in North Korea's court, and so far the default position coming out of the end of last year has been one of retrenchment and kind of hunkering down in the face of sanctions rather than any signal that relief is on the way. And so the really interesting question is, is that just a top-line cover position by North Korea, or are they actually more desperate than we may realize, in which case Kim Jong-un may find himself in a situation where he has to engineer some kind of change or adjustment.
Well, Scott just mentioned that the ball is on North Korea's court, and we've heard for the first time a senior administration official saying that the denuclearization talks won't be affected by the U.S. domestic politics. Do you think this will have some kind of impact on their strategies going forward?
Yeah, that comment was interesting about mentioning the North Korea issue in the context of the election, because you could take it one of two ways. On the one hand, it suggests that, or gives the idea that maybe Trump is not constrained by the election and could be more generous and willing to deal. In other words, if North Korea is simply waiting out the election because they don't think anything can happen, maybe this is a U.S. signal that, hey, we're still serious and ready to deal. On the other hand, you could interpret it as an indication that I'm comfortable. I don't need to be pressed to come up with some kind of North Korea win for the sake of an election, so don't expect me to be compromising and flexible. So you could read it one of two ways. I'm not sure how North Korea sees it, but I still, all the indications we've seen, North Korea has shut the door on any talks with Japan, called Prime Minister Abe all kinds of things, shut the door on meaningful cooperation with South Korea, and the Moon administration has been shut the door on talks with the United States. So it would have to be a kind of a major turnaround for North Korea to really be much more proactive.
So we clearly need a breakthrough. We clearly need a momentum in the talks going forward, and we're expecting the U.S.-South Korea military drills to resume. So what kind of an impact, what kind of an effect do you think this will have on the U.S. and North Korea from this military drills?
Well, I'm sure this is a big debate within the U.S. administration, and we had on Capitol Hill just this past week the Undersecretary of Defense presenting and senior military official. They highlighted the fact that we had over 200 military exercises last year with South Korea, albeit smaller scale, and some big high-profile events were canceled. I think there are some who want to resume more high-profile or more larger, significant exercises with South Korea in the United States. And there's probably others who want to keep some room for diplomacy. I think they need to ramp that up a little bit. They've been holding back, and we have OPCON transition, wartime operational control, transition planning, and all kinds of things that need to be practiced. So this could be a real point of tension that forces the issue down the line.
Mm-hmm. Scott, do you think that the drills should be scaled down or should be conducted as full scale?
The basis upon which the drills have been revised has been to make space for diplomacy. And so it begs the question, if diplomacy is not happening, what is the rationale for the self-restraint on the U.S. and ROK side? And of course, this mirrors North Korea's assertion that they're not getting what they want, so why should they show self-restraint on missile testing or nuclear testing? So, I mean, in a way, I think that it just shows that we're still locked in a competition between the U.S. and North Korea to shape the security environment of the other side in order to induce a concession on the other side. And we're really not at a stage where it's likely that we'll have a productive give-and-take negotiation process.
Then, Jim, how much longer do you think we should be adjusting these drills to keep this door for a diplomacy open?
Well, if I was arguing within the administration right now, I'd be arguing for more significant exercises and a little bit less restraint. For readiness, for deterrence, it would be useful. The other thing to add is the host nation support negotiations, because where does exercises and that negotiation come in? If South Korea holds the line and says we're not going to significantly increase what we're going to pay, maybe this downsizing of exercises or lowering the cost of the troops in South Korea becomes something that the U.S. or some in the U.S. administration want to pull back on. So the two issues are kind of connected.
Mm-hmm. So when these drills resume, we're expecting North Korea's lashback to these exercises. Then how do we find an opening for diplomacy here? We certainly need a momentum going, right?
If the North Koreans are really upset about the exercises, they could propose tension reduction negotiations with the U.S. to talk about conventional arms control issues. Or the U.S. side could do that. One of the really interesting things about Esper's visit to Seoul last November is we had this moment where Esper announced that we were not going to do an air exercise, and the North Koreans responded in a kind of positive way. But, that is an issue that's outside the Singapore Declaration. It's not part of the 4 points. And so there's no reason why we can't talk about it separately from the Singapore Declaration.
Mm-hmm. Jim, do you think that the U.S. can bring in China or South Korea for this momentum, for getting these talks going?
I always remain hopeful that there's some potential in North-South dialogue. I continue to be kind of bewildered by the fact that North Korea seems so reluctant to engage with a very willing partner that in some ways could potentially create friction in the U.S.-South Korea alliance and open up potential benefits. Particularly with this coronavirus health scare in the area of healthcare. There's also the swine fever dynamic that has come over from China to some extent. There are many avenues that I think South Korea would be willing to engage with North Korea on, and there's some potential there if the U.S. really backs that and supports that. But again, so far North Korea hasn't shown an interest in that area. And the China piece you mentioned, I think China is very important right now as a bit of a lifeline for North Korea in terms of sanctions evasion and keeping things relatively stable, but very preoccupied with the coronavirus right now, and not wanting to go too far in breaking with the sanctions regime. So I'm not sure how much we can rely on China in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Let's now watch video for our next topic.
국가 비상 반영 체계로 전환한다는 걸 선포했고,
비루스가 침습할 수 있는 모든 공간을 빈틈없이 차단해야 합니다.
North Korea remains on high alert as it continues to fight the coronavirus. It's shut the borders with China and Russia. Given that it's heavily dependent on Beijing, its economy is expected to be hit hard. What impact will the coronavirus have on North Korea as it emphasizes a self-reliant economy amid international sanctions? So, Jim, North Korean media is giving precautionary measures to its people on a daily basis. How alarming, how concerning is the coronavirus in North Korea right now?
Well, it's hard for me to tell, obviously from here especially, and I'm not a medical expert. But I have done research over time on various pandemics with avian flu and others and trying to foster regional cooperation. And we've made a lot of progress with the WHO and regional cooperation in this area. North Korea is always a big hole in that system. In this particular case, though, I'm a little less concerned. So North Korea has some strengths in the fact that its economy is not widely interconnected and with the rest of the world or even domestically, and they have the power, the political power, to kind of control the population. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that it's not going to be a major outbreak in North Korea.
So we've seen North Korea saying that this fight against the coronavirus is a matter of national existence. So why is this so important to North Korea right now? Is there a political reason behind this?
Well, what's really telling is the awareness of the vulnerability that North Korea faces in the public health sector. And I think that what's really been striking is the level of attention given in state media to precautions and to measures that are proactive that the state media is recommending be taken. And so regardless of whether they're responding to actual cases or rumors, it's very clear that they are highly mobilized to use this, either because there's a real threat or to capitalize on it for political purposes, to reinforce isolation and to kind of emphasize the importance of retrenchment and re-centralization of control.
So at a time when North Korea is pushing for self-reliance against international sanctions, what kind of an impact do you think this virus will have on its economy?
Well, certainly in the areas bordering China, I think there's the potential for some significant impact. A lot of people rely on trade and engagement with China in some shape or form for their livelihood, and that's got to be made more difficult. And that's probably the one vulnerability that North Korea has, because maybe the state can't control everybody's interactions with Chinese when they're so motivated to continue to keep food on the table. But again, I still see actually North Korea's backwardness in its economy and isolation as a little bit of a benefit here in this situation. This peters out by April or so. I don't think it'll be a major hit to their economy.
Well, there is a smuggling of goods from China to North Korea, and there's, of course, unofficial trade data that aren't recorded. So definitely China is expected to be the hardest hit country with the virus. Considering that China is North Korea's largest trading partner, what kind of a spillover effect do you think this will have on the North Korean economy?
Well, I agree with Jem that this is really, the critical factor is duration. But where North Korea is vulnerable is related to liquidity, and that is a function of the extent to which exchange is possible. But goods are easier to flow than people, and so we'll have to wait and see what this ends up looking like. I do believe that there will be a temporary shock as a result of even informal trade probably being curtailed. And that will have some kind of impact on the North Korean economy. But it really has to be sustained for it to have a dramatic effect, I think, inside North Korea.
Mm-hmm. And on the diplomatic front, it was expected that North Korea was going to strengthen its ties with Russia and China. So do you think this spread of the virus will have any kind of impact in diplomacy with those countries?
Well, it's certainly going to curtail diplomatic activity, I think, to some extent. It's not going to be as robust engagement certainly between China and North Korea with the travel restrictions and all. I actually think this is an opportunity maybe for the United States and the international agencies to step in. Maybe not the United States out front, but there are a number of NGOs and non-governmental organizations who are active in North Korea, providing health services and other types of development programs. There probably are ways to boost support and funding for some of these groups that are active in North Korea already, that have some trust with the local population, to augment and support North Korea's fighting and protection against this virus. So I see maybe it's a chance to pivot away from a China-Russia focus, because that's all they think they have, to maybe a little bit more of an expanded diplomatic option.
I think Jim is putting his finger on something very interesting, and that is that in moments of vulnerability and need, North Korea has historically been more open to international public health or humanitarian engagement. And so in some ways, that does mean that this is an opportunity for the international community. With regard to China and Russia and the North Korean emphasis, I think we'll just have to wait and see, but essentially everything is likely to be delayed, especially because of China's preoccupation with its own domestic challenges.
Mm-hmm. But with North Korea shutting off its borders with neighboring countries, wouldn't it be difficult for North Korea to be getting aid from the international organizations outside?
Sure, that can have an impact, but I think that the bigger challenge for international aid organizations, despite sanctions, continues to be whether or not North Korea is willing to allow access to individuals with the greatest need. And historically, North Korea shows greater flexibility when it feels greater vulnerability.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment. Now it's time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea photo of the week. Today we have a letter from Megumi Yokota's mother to her daughter. As you recall, Megumi Yokota was kidnapped by a North Korea agent at the age of 13. Megumi's mother writes that she is old and urges the Japanese government to bring back all Japanese abductees from North Korea. This letter was published by the Japanese Hankei newspaper as Megumi's mother turned 84 this week. Scott, what do you make of this?
What is remarkable to me is that as the parents of abductees in Japan have aged, it's had a kind of impact on policy in the sense of greater openness and greater sense of a need for connection because they know that time is not on their side. And so in a weird sort of way, it does mean that conditions are ripe on the Japan side for a more flexible approach by Prime Minister Abe, but it's not clear that the North Korean side is ready to reciprocate.
Right, and of course this week was a big week on this front in Japan, because a 94-year-old mother of an abductee in North Korea passed away this week, and so together with that letter, it really, what my impression is, this is really pulling at the heartstrings, in a sense, of the Japanese public. Traditionally, that has in some ways hardened public attitudes and continued to put this issue at the top of the agenda for any dialogue between Japan and North Korea. Prime Minister Abe reiterated again his willingness to meet with Kim Jong-un with no preconditions, but with this kind of high profile in the public, there's no way he can avoid not putting that very high up in the list of things he wants to talk about, which of course makes it even more difficult, I think, for North Korea to agree to such talks.
Right.
So it's, unfortunately, it probably underscores the likelihood of a persistent freeze in North Korea-Japan relations.
This is definitely a pressing issue for Japan, as only 5 Japanese abductees have come back since the 2002 Japan and North Korea summit. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Jim, Scott, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That does it for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.